The neighborhood was a picture of serenity. Tree-lined streets, modest homes with well-tended lawns, and a sense of community that made everyone feel safe. It was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other by name and children rode their bikes freely without a care in the world. Nestled in the heart of this suburban paradise was the Howard household, where Melissa Howard eagerly prepared for the arrival of her first child. Melissa was radiant, the glow of pregnancy complementing her warm personality. At 32, she was ready to embrace motherhood, filling her days with plans for the nursery, prenatal classes, and dreaming about the life she would share with her baby. Her friends often teased her about her excitement, but Melissa didn't mind. "This is everything I've ever wanted," she'd say with a laugh, her hands instinctively resting on her growing belly. Bryan Howard, her husband, seemed to share her enthusiasm, or at least he tried to. He was a man of routine, always methodical and composed, but lately there was an edge to him that Melissa couldn't ignore. He spent more hours at work, often coming home late with vague explanations about catching up. When Melissa tried to ask about it, Bryan would brush her off with a tight smile, saying, "You worry too much, everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. Unbeknownst to Melissa, Bryan was drowning in debt, and the stress of their financial situation was eating away at him. Melissa had noticed small changes: his reluctance to talk about their budget, the way he tensed up whenever the mail arrived. Yet she chalked it up to the pressures of impending parenthood, choosing to believe that it was just a phase. One evening, as Melissa was setting the table for dinner, Bryan's phone buzzed on the counter. He snatched it up quickly, his expression hardening as he read the message. "Work," he muttered, slipping the phone into his pocket. The sudden shift in his demeanor sent a chill down Melissa's spine. She didn't press further, but the silence between them over dinner was deafening. The next day, Melissa confided in her best friend Angela. "Bryan's been distant," she admitted, her voice tinged with worry. "I feel like there's something he's not telling me." Angela, ever the voice of reason, reassured her. "It's probably just stress. Men have a funny way of dealing with pressure. Give him some time." Still, the unease lingered. That weekend, Melissa tried to reconnect with Bryan, suggesting they take a walk around the neighborhood. As they strolled past their neighbors' homes, Bryan's gaze seemed far away, his responses clipped and distracted. When they passed the lake at the end of their street, Melissa paused, her eyes scanning the tranquil water. "We should come here more often," she said softly, but Bryan's only reply was a faint grunt as he checked his phone. Unbeknownst to Melissa, that lake would soon become the epicenter of a tragedy that would shatter the quiet suburban life they had built. The morning sun bathed the quiet neighborhood in soft golden light as Melissa Howard prepared for what she thought would be a typical day. She had planned to run a few errands, grocery shopping, a quick stop at the pharmacy, and then return home to finish organizing the nursery. Her to-do list was scribbled neatly on a notepad, tucked in her handbag along with her phone and keys. Bryan was already up, sipping coffee at the kitchen table, his gaze fixed on the newspaper. His presence felt distant, like a shadow of the man she used to know. Melissa kissed him on the cheek, though he barely looked up. "I won't be long," she said softly, masking the twinge of unease in her chest. "Drive safe," Bryan replied, his voice devoid of emotion. That was the last time anyone in the neighborhood would see Melissa alive. Hours passed and Melissa didn't return home. Bryan claimed he wasn't initially concerned. She probably got caught up somewhere, he told himself, shrugging it off. But by evening, when the house remained silent and her car was nowhere to be found, a sliver of worry crept into his mind. He picked up his phone and called her. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. It wasn't until the following day that Bryan finally made the call to report Melissa missing. His voice was calm, even as he spoke to the dispatcher. "She left yesterday morning and hasn't come back. I've called her phone, but it goes straight to voicemail." The community's reaction was swift. Flyers were printed and posted on telephone poles and shop windows. Melissa's parents arrived, distraught, pleading with the neighbors to join the search. Volunteers combed through the nearby woods and parks, their voices echoing Melissa's name across the tranquil suburb. Bryan's demeanor during the search raised eyebrows. While others were visibly emotional, his expression remained curiously detached. He answered questions from the police with measured precision, avoiding eye contact. "We've had our disagreements," he admitted to Detective Scott Harris, who led the investigation. "But nothing out of the ordinary. I just want her home." Angela, Melissa's best friend, was among the first to voice her doubts. She told me Bryan was acting strange, Angela confided to a reporter. She said he'd been distant, secretive. This doesn't feel right. Her words planted a seed of suspicion that quickly took root. As the hours turned into days, hope began to wane. The search expanded to the nearby lake, a popular spot for fishing and picnics. Volunteers waded through the shallow waters, their faces set in grim determination. Bryan, however, remained conspicuously absent. "I've done everything I can," he told one of the officers, his tone clipped. "I can't just stand around." Detective Harris wasn't convinced. Something about Bryan's responses felt rehearsed, too deliberate. "When was the last time you saw her?" Harris asked during a second round of questioning. Bryan hesitated. "Morning. She said she was running errands." His pause was slight but noticeable, like the hiccup of a guilty conscience. Melissa's family, meanwhile, struggled to keep their spirits up. Her mother appeared on local news, her voice cracking as she addressed the camera. "Melissa, if you can hear this, please come home. We love you. We miss you." The plea left viewers across the community in tears, but it seemed to have little effect on Bryan, who sat stiffly next to her, his hands clasped tightly. By the end of the week, police began canvassing the neighborhood for clues. A neighbor, Mrs. Palmer, mentioned seeing Bryan's car leave the driveway late the night Melissa disappeared. "It was strange," she recalled. "He's not usually out that late." The weight of suspicion began to press down on Bryan like a vice, but he remained resolute, denying any involvement. "I had nothing to do with this," he told the police, his jaw clenched. Yet behind the calm facade, his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. Was it fear? Guilt? Or perhaps a calculated attempt to keep his secrets buried just a little longer? The search for Melissa Howard began as the sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Flyers with her photograph, radiant and smiling, fluttered on lampposts and bulletin boards, a stark contrast to the growing sense of dread that gripped the community. "Missing" was printed in bold letters above her name, followed by a desperate plea. "If you have any information, please call." Dozens of volunteers, including neighbors, friends, and even strangers, gathered at the local park to organize the effort. Melissa's father stood at the forefront, his weathered hands trembling as he handed out maps of the area. "She's out there somewhere," he said, his voice breaking. "We need to bring her home." Bryan was there too, though his presence seemed more perfunctory than heartfelt. He kept to the edges of the crowd, nodding stiffly when approached, but avoiding prolonged conversation. When Detective Scott Harris arrived to oversee the search, Bryan's posture visibly stiffened. "You don't think she just ran off, do you?" Bryan asked, his tone clipped. Harris tilted his head, studying him. "We explore every possibility, Mr. Howard," he replied evenly, his eyes narrowing. The search parties dispersed, spreading out across fields, woods, and streets. Angela joined a group scouring the park trails, her jaw set in grim determination. "Melissa wouldn't just vanish," she muttered under her breath. "Something's wrong." Hours turned into a day, and the initial optimism began to wane. Reports trickled in from volunteers. No sign of Melissa, no discarded belongings, nothing. Angela, her face flushed from exertion, confronted Bryan as he stood by his car. "She told me she was scared, Bryan," she hissed. "What did you do?" Bryan recoiled, his expression darkening. "Watch your mouth," he snapped, before turning on his heel and walking away. Angela's gut tightened. Something about his reaction didn't sit right. Back at the Howard home, the tension was palpable. Melissa's mother sat at the dining table, clutching a framed photo of her daughter. "She's such a good girl," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She wouldn't just leave." Bryan, sitting across from her, rubbed his temples. "I've already told the police everything I know," he muttered. "This constant questioning, it's not helping." Meanwhile, Detective Harris was piecing together the puzzle. A team of officers began interviewing neighbors, hoping for any shred of information. Mrs. Palmer, the elderly woman next door, mentioned something that caught Harris's attention. "I saw his car leave late that night," she said, wringing her hands. "It was strange. I thought they were both home." Harris made a note, his pen scratching against the notepad. "Did you see anyone else? Hear anything unusual?" Mrs. Palmer hesitated. "No, just the car. But he was in a hurry. That much I can tell you." The following morning, search efforts shifted to the lake at the edge of the neighborhood. Its calm, reflective surface betrayed no secrets, but Harris felt an inexplicable pull toward it. He ordered a team to investigate, their boots crunching against the gravel shore. Bryan watched from a distance, his jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "They're wasting time." Angela wasn't convinced. She approached Detective Harris, her voice low. "Melissa confided in me about Bryan," she said. "He's been acting strange for weeks. Secretive, distant. She didn't feel safe." Harris nodded, filing the information away. "Thank you," he said. "Every piece helps." As the search continued, Bryan's behavior only fueled suspicion. He declined to join the lake search, citing exhaustion, but his absence didn't go unnoticed. Harris watched him leave, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What are you hiding?" he murmured under his breath. The day ended with no new leads, but Harris knew they were circling closer to the truth. The pieces were there, disjointed but slowly aligning. As night fell, he made his way back to his office, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his shoulders. Somewhere out there, Melissa's story waited to be uncovered, and Harris was determined to find it. The morning air was heavy with tension as the search teams arrived at the lake. Its glassy surface reflected the pale sky above, betraying nothing of what lay beneath. Detective Scott Harris stood at the edge of the shore, his sharp gaze scanning the water. "Start with the shallow areas," he instructed the team, his voice steady but firm. There was a gnawing sense in his gut that the answers they sought were close. Volunteers watched silently as officers waded into the lake, their poles probing the murky depths. The air was thick with unspoken fear, the quiet only broken by the occasional splash of water. Among the onlookers was Angela, her arms crossed tightly, as she kept a vigilant eye on Bryan, who stood further back, his face a mask of controlled indifference. "Why isn't he helping?" Angela whispered to Melissa's father, who stood beside her. He shook his head, his face pale and drawn. "He says he's too overwhelmed," he muttered, though the bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. Hours ticked by with no sign of anything unusual. Harris's mind raced with scenarios. What if Melissa wasn't here? What if this was another dead end? But just as he began to lose hope, one of the officers called out, his voice sharp and urgent. "Detective, over here!" The crowd tensed as Harris sprinted toward the commotion. The officer pointed to a tangled mass caught in the reeds near the shore. As they pulled it closer, the horror of what they'd found became undeniable. A piece of fabric, a pale floral print, was caught among the debris. Harris's heart sank. It matched the description of the dress Melissa had been wearing the day she disappeared. "Get the divers in here now," Harris barked, his tone leaving no room for delay. Within minutes, a team of divers was suiting up, their faces grim as they slipped beneath the surface. The crowd held its collective breath, the stillness broken only by the sound of Bryan pacing restlessly. When the divers resurfaced, they brought with them a truth that shattered any remaining hope. The lifeless body of Melissa Howard, weighted down by heavy concrete blocks, was carefully pulled from the depths. Gasps and muffled sobs rippled through the crowd. Angela turned away, tears streaming down her face, while Melissa's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, her cries piercing the heavy air. Bryan remained frozen in place, his expression inscrutable. Harris approached him, his eyes locked on the man's face. "This isn't the end of the investigation, Mr. Howard," he said coldly. Bryan didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the water as if willing himself to disappear into it. Forensic teams quickly cordoned off the area, their movements precise and methodical. Harris knelt by the shoreline, his mind racing as he observed the scene. The concrete blocks were crudely tied with rope, suggesting desperation rather than planning. But it was the duct tape around Melissa's wrists that struck him most, a chilling indication that she'd been restrained before her death. "Get this analyzed," Harris ordered, handing a fragment of the tape to a technician. "I want every print, every fiber. Don't miss a thing." Meanwhile, the media frenzy erupted as news of the discovery spread. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled for statements, and the quiet neighborhood was transformed into a circus. Melissa's family, shielded by friends and volunteers, refused to speak, their grief too raw to articulate. Angela, however, didn't hold back when approached by a reporter. "Someone did this to her," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "And whoever it was, they won't get away with it." As night fell, the lake remained eerily silent, as if mourning the life it had concealed. Harris stood alone at the water's edge, his hands clenched into fists. He knew the real work was just beginning. Somewhere out there was the person responsible for Melissa's death, and Harris was determined to bring them to justice. Behind him, Bryan slipped away from the crowd, his shoulders hunched as he made his way home. But Harris noticed, and though he didn't say a word, his sharp eyes followed Bryan until he disappeared into the shadows. The discovery of Melissa's body had sent shockwaves through the community. While the neighborhood grieved, the focus of the investigation tightened like a noose around Bryan Howard. Detective Scott Harris had been watching him closely since the search began, and now, with the grim truth of Melissa's fate, Bryan's every word, every action was under microscopic scrutiny. At the station, Harris reviewed the evidence spread across his desk, the fragments of duct tape, photographs of the concrete blocks, and Melissa's floral dress, now a haunting artifact. This wasn't random, Harris muttered to himself. This was personal. Bryan was summoned for a second round of questioning. He arrived, his posture stiff and defensive, but his face betrayed none of the grief one might expect from a husband who had just lost his wife. As he sat across from Harris in the small, dimly lit interrogation room, the tension was palpable. "Thanks for coming in again," Harris began, his tone neutral but firm. "We just need to clarify a few things." Bryan nodded curtly. "I already told you everything I know." Harris leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Let's talk about the night Melissa disappeared. You said she left to run errands that morning, but your neighbor, Mrs. Palmer, mentioned seeing your car leave late that night. Care to explain?" Bryan's jaw tightened. "I went out for a drive. I couldn't sleep." Harris didn't blink. "Strange time for a drive, don't you think? And where exactly did you go?" "Nowhere specific," Bryan replied, his voice flat. "Just needed to clear my head." The detective's eyes narrowed. "Did it help?" Bryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, I don't know what you're implying, but I loved my wife. I would never hurt her." Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out a photograph, the duct tape that had been used to bind Melissa's wrists. "We found this on her body. Forensics is working on it now. If there's anything you want to tell us before the results come back, now's the time." Bryan's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "I have nothing to say." After Bryan left the station, Harris's instincts told him to dig deeper. His team had already begun tracing Bryan's movements in the days leading up to Melissa's disappearance. One piece of evidence stood out, a receipt from a local hardware store dated 2 days before Melissa went missing. The items purchased: concrete blocks and rope. Harris visited the store himself, speaking to the cashier who had been working that day. "Yeah, I remember him," the man said, scratching his beard. "Seemed in a hurry, didn't say much, just paid and left." The noose was tightening. Back in the neighborhood, rumors swirled. Bryan's absence at community vigils had not gone unnoticed, and his aloof demeanor during the search efforts raised more than a few eyebrows. "He's hiding something," Angela said to Melissa's parents one evening. "I know it." Melissa's father, his face hollow with grief, nodded. He always seemed detached, even before all this. As the investigation progressed, Harris's team uncovered yet another piece of damning evidence: Bryan's cell phone records. The data showed his phone had pinged a tower near the lake the night Melissa disappeared, directly contradicting his claim of aimlessly driving. Harris couldn't ignore the pattern. "He's slipping," the detective murmured to himself as he pieced the timeline together. "The lies are unraveling." Back at home, Bryan was feeling the pressure. Alone in the quiet of his living room, he poured himself a drink, his hands trembling as he stared into the glass. The walls seemed to close in around him, the weight of his secrets pressing down like the concrete blocks that had sunk his wife to the bottom of the lake. Unbeknownst to Bryan, Harris was already preparing the next step, a warrant to search the Howard residence. He had no intention of leaving any stone unturned. The stakes were too high, and the truth was within reach. Detective Scott Harris sifted through his notes, his sharp eyes narrowing as he pieced together the growing case against Bryan Howard. The evidence was compelling, but something was missing. Someone who could tie the fragmented clues together. And then, a lead arrived, almost by chance. Angela, Melissa's best friend, had come forward again, this time with more than suspicions. She had found text messages on her phone from Melissa dated just days before her disappearance. "She was scared, Detective," Angela said, her voice trembling as she handed over her phone. She didn't say much, but she hinted at something, at Bryan. The texts were brief but chilling. In one, Melissa wrote, "He's been acting strange again. I'm not sure I can trust him anymore." Another simply read, "If anything happens to me, please look into it." Harris's heart sank as he read the words. He thanked Angela and promised her that every detail would be investigated. But it was her next revelation that shifted the entire course of the investigation. There's one more thing, she said hesitantly. Melissa told me she saw Bryan with someone else. A woman. She didn't say who, but I think he was having an affair. The possibility of an affair added a new layer of complexity to the case. Harris immediately had his team dig into Bryan's recent activity. Credit card records revealed charges at a downtown restaurant and a boutique hotel, places Bryan had no reason to visit, especially without Melissa. As Harris delved deeper, another key witness emerged, a neighbor named Carla, who lived 2 houses down from the Howards. Carla had been hesitant to come forward, afraid of getting involved, but the discovery of Melissa's body had shaken her into action. I saw him, Carla told Harris during an interview at the station. The night she went missing, I saw Bryan in his driveway. He was loading something into his trunk. It looked heavy, like a big bag or something. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to assume anything. Harris's pen paused mid-sentence. What time was this? He asked, his voice steady but intense. Around midnight, Carla replied. I was letting my dog out and I saw him. He didn't notice me. The timeline was damning. Bryan's claim of a sleepless drive to clear his head now seemed like a blatant lie. Combined with the texts from Melissa and the emerging evidence of a possible affair, Harris felt the pieces falling into place. Meanwhile, the media frenzy around the case was growing. News outlets plastered Bryan's face across screens, dubbing him the grieving husband under suspicion. Reporters camped outside his home, their cameras trained on the front door. Bryan, visibly rattled, refused to comment, but his silence only fueled public speculation. Inside the Howard home, the pressure was mounting. Bryan paced the living room, his movements restless and agitated. He turned on the TV, only to see his own face staring back at him, accompanied by the words "person of interest." He slammed the remote down, his hands shaking. That evening, Harris visited Angela again, hoping to gain more insight into Melissa's state of mind before her disappearance. Did she ever say why she was afraid? He asked, his tone gentle but probing. Angela hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. She didn't want to believe it, but she thought Bryan might hurt her. She said he had a temper, and lately he'd been snapping over the smallest things. Harris nodded, his expression grim. Did she ever mention the life insurance policy? Angela's eyes widened. No, but now that you mention it, she did say Bryan was more concerned about money than usual. She thought it was just stress from the baby, but I guess it was more than that. Harris left Angela's house with a heavy heart. The picture was becoming clearer, but it was also more tragic than he'd imagined. Melissa had seen the warning signs, but she had stayed, hoping things would get better. Now her trust had cost her everything. Back at the station, Harris reviewed Carla's statement and Angela's texts once more. We're closing in, he said to his team, but we need one final piece to seal this case. Find out who the other woman is, and fast. The clock was ticking, and Harris knew that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous Bryan could become. The interrogation room was colder than usual, or perhaps it was just Bryan Howard's unease filling the air. He sat stiffly, his hands folded tightly on the table, staring at Detective Harris. Across from him, Harris placed a file on the table, opening it slowly, deliberately. Bryan, Harris began, his tone calm but firm, we need to revisit the night Melissa disappeared. Bryan exhaled sharply. I've already told you I went out for a drive. I couldn't sleep. Harris leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. And yet, your neighbor Carla recalls seeing you in your driveway at midnight, loading something into your car. Care to explain? Bryan's jaw tightened. I don't know what she thinks she saw, but it wasn't me. She's probably mistaken. Carla's pretty sure it was you, Harris countered. And then there's this. He slid a document across the table, a printout of Bryan's cell phone records. Your phone pinged a tower near the lake that night. That's quite a coincidence, don't you think? Bryan's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his composure. I told you. I was driving. That doesn't prove anything. It proves you lied about where you were, Harris said, his voice growing sharper. And the receipts from the hardware store don't help your case either. Concrete blocks, rope, purchased 2 days before Melissa went missing. What were you planning to do with those, Bryan? Bryan's fingers drummed nervously on the table. I don't have to explain every purchase I make. Maybe I was planning a project. That's not a crime. Harris smirked faintly, leaning back in his chair. A project? At midnight? Near a lake? With duct tape found on your wife's body bearing your fingerprints? The room fell silent. Bryan's breathing grew heavier and his facade of control began to crack. I didn't kill her. he said, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't. Harris observed him for a long moment, the silence stretching like a taut wire. You're running out of time, Bryan, he said finally. If there's something you want to say, now's your chance. Bryan's head dropped slightly, his hands now clenched into fists. I need to speak to my lawyer, he muttered. As Bryan was escorted out, Harris watched him through the glass window of the observation room. He's unraveling, Harris said to Officer Daniels, standing beside him. We just need one more piece to push him over the edge. That piece arrived later that day in the form of Vanessa, the woman Bryan had been secretly seeing. She had come forward after seeing the media coverage, her face pale and drawn as she sat across from Harris in the same interrogation room. I didn't know this would happen, Vanessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me he was unhappy, but I never thought he'd do something like this. What exactly did he tell you, Vanessa? Harris asked, his tone careful but probing. Vanessa hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. He said he felt trapped, that Melissa's pregnancy was too much for him to handle, and then he mentioned the life insurance policy, how it could solve all his problems. Harris's pen paused on the notepad. He mentioned the policy? Vanessa nodded. Yes, he said it was enough to start over, to leave everything behind. With Vanessa's testimony, the case against Bryan grew even stronger. Harris felt the momentum shifting, the evidence stacking higher and higher. But he knew Bryan was a calculating man, and it would take more than just cracks in his alibi to break him entirely. That evening, Harris reviewed the case files once more, each piece fitting together like the edges of a puzzle. The receipts, the phone records, the duct tape, all of it painted a damning picture. And now, with Vanessa's statement, the motive was clear. Bryan hadn't just lied. He had meticulously planned every detail, thinking he could outsmart them all. But as Harris stared at Bryan's mugshot pinned to the corkboard, he felt a grim satisfaction. The cracks were there, and soon the whole structure would collapse. The revelation of Bryan Howard's affair sent shockwaves through the case. For Detective Scott Harris, Vanessa's testimony was a game-changer. Not only did it highlight Bryan's motive, but it also painted a chilling picture of a man willing to destroy everything to escape his responsibilities. Vanessa sat across from Harris in the interrogation room, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. I didn't want to get involved, she began, her voice cracking. But after seeing everything on the news, I can't stay silent anymore. Take your time, Harris replied, his tone calm but probing. Tell me everything Bryan said to you. Vanessa hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, she exhaled deeply. He said he was unhappy, that Melissa's pregnancy wasn't part of his plan. At first, I thought he was just venting. But then he started talking about money, about the life insurance. Harris's pen moved swiftly across the notepad. What exactly did he say about the policy? Vanessa swallowed hard. He said it was enough to solve all his problems, that he could start fresh, with me. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Harris leaned forward slightly. Did he ever mention how he planned to do it? Vanessa's hands tightened around the tissue. Not directly, she admitted, but there was this one time. He said something about how accidents can happen, how life doesn't always go the way we expect. Harris nodded, his expression unreadable. Did you think he was serious? I didn't want to believe it, Vanessa whispered, but now I know I was wrong. Outside the interrogation room, Harris briefed his team on the new developments. Vanessa's testimony confirms everything we've suspected, he said. Bryan saw that policy as his way out, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. As the investigation dug deeper into Bryan's affair, more unsettling details emerged. Credit card records revealed dinners at expensive restaurants, weekend getaways, and lavish gifts, all for Vanessa. It was a stark contrast to his claims of financial hardship at home. Back in the neighborhood, rumors of Bryan's infidelity spread like wildfire. Angela was among the first to confront him. She caught him in his driveway, her arms crossed and her eyes blazing with anger. How could you? She demanded, her voice shaking. Melissa trusted you. She loved you. And you were off playing house with someone else? Bryan's face darkened, his expression hardening. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, brushing past her and slamming the door behind him. But Angela's words lingered, echoing in his mind long after she'd left. Meanwhile, Melissa's parents were grappling with the devastating truth. Her mother sat at the dining table, staring at a photograph of her daughter with tears streaming down her face. How could he do this to her? She whispered, her voice thick with grief. How could he betray her like this? Harris, determined to leave no stone unturned, visited Vanessa again the next day. This time, she handed over a series of text messages from Bryan, messages that left no doubt about his intentions. In one, he wrote, "Once this is over, we'll be free. Just hold on a little longer." "Did he ever say what this was?" Harris asked, his tone sharp. Vanessa shook her head. "No, but I think we both know now." With Vanessa's testimony, the text messages, and the financial records, the case against Bryan was becoming airtight. Harris knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down around him. As night fell, Harris sat alone in his office, staring at the growing stack of evidence. Bryan's secret life had finally come to light, but the full extent of his betrayal was still unfolding. And with each new revelation, Harris's resolve to bring him to justice only deepened. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Bryan Howard entered, flanked by his defense team. The room was packed with journalists, spectators, and Melissa's grieving family, all awaiting the start of the trial. Cameras outside the courthouse flashed incessantly, capturing the beginning of what had become a national spectacle. Detective Scott Harris sat in the back row, his sharp eyes fixed on Bryan's every move. He noted the defendant's composed demeanor, his calculated glance toward the jury, and the subtle tightening of his jaw when Melissa's parents entered the room. Bryan's mask of calm was holding, for now. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. District Attorney Caroline West stood before the jury, her tone measured but powerful. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case of betrayal, greed, and premeditated murder. The evidence will show that Bryan Howard meticulously planned the killing of his wife, Melissa, motivated by financial gain." West's words hit the room like a hammer. The jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions grim as the prosecution began to present the evidence. The first witness called to the stand was Angela, Melissa's best friend. Her voice trembled as she recounted the last conversation she had with Melissa. "She told me she was scared," Angela said, tears welling in her eyes. "She didn't trust Bryan anymore. She thought something bad was going to happen." Bryan's defense attorney objected, arguing that Angela's testimony was speculative, but the judge allowed it. Angela's words hung in the air, casting a shadow over Bryan's carefully curated image of innocence. Next, the prosecution introduced the text messages between Bryan and Vanessa. West read them aloud, her voice steady and deliberate. "Once this is over, we'll be free," she quoted, pausing for effect. What could Bryan Howard have meant by this? The evidence suggests it was a plan to murder his wife. Vanessa was called to the stand next. Her hands shook as she held onto the railing, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said the life insurance would solve everything," she testified. "He said he couldn't see another way out." In the audience, Melissa's mother buried her face in her hands, her quiet sobs echoing in the otherwise silent courtroom. The emotional weight of Vanessa's testimony was palpable, and even some jurors looked visibly shaken. But the prosecution wasn't done. They brought in forensic experts who detailed the evidence found at the scene: Bryan's fingerprints on the duct tape, the receipts for the concrete blocks, and the cell phone records placing him at the lake the night Melissa disappeared. Each piece of evidence stacked higher, forming a nearly insurmountable wall against Bryan. The defense attempted to counter, portraying Bryan as a man overwhelmed by stress and trying to hold his life together. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof linking Bryan to Melissa's death. "My client is not a killer," the defense attorney declared. "He is a victim of a tragic misunderstanding." But the jury remained stone-faced, their focus unwavering as the prosecution continued to dismantle Bryan's alibi. One of the final witnesses was Carla, the neighbor who had seen Bryan loading something into his car late at night. "It was him," Carla testified firmly. "I saw him. He was moving quickly like he didn't want anyone to see." The final blow came when Melissa's mother took the stand. Her voice cracked as she described her daughter's dreams of becoming a mother, her joy at preparing for the baby, and the devastating moment she learned her daughter was gone. "She didn't deserve this," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "And neither did her baby." As the day's proceedings came to a close, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Bryan's expression had grown stonier with each passing hour, but Harris noticed a flicker of something else in his eyes: fear. The walls were closing in, and Bryan knew it. As the court adjourned, Melissa's parents embraced Angela, their faces etched with grief and determination. Harris lingered near the back, his mind racing with the possibilities of what tomorrow's testimonies would bring. The trial was far from over, but the truth was inching closer to the surface. And with every witness, every piece of evidence, Bryan's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Detective Scott Harris stood before the court, a projector humming quietly beside him. The lights dimmed, casting a sharp focus on the screen that now displayed Bryan Howard's digital footprints. This was the moment Harris had been building toward, a trail of online searches and activity that laid bare Bryan's premeditation. "Members of the jury," Harris began, his voice steady, "what you are about to see is a window into Bryan Howard's mind in the weeks leading up to Melissa's disappearance." The first slide appeared, a screenshot of a search engine query. The words chilled the courtroom. How to dispose of a body in water. Gasps rippled through the audience. Melissa's mother buried her face in her hands, unable to bear the implications. Bryan, seated at the defense table, stiffened, his jaw tightening as if willing himself not to react. "This search," Harris continued, clicking to the next slide, "was conducted just 3 days before Melissa was last seen. But it doesn't stop there." The screen shifted again, revealing another query. How much weight to sink a person? The room fell silent, the gravity of the evidence bearing down on everyone present. Harris paused, his gaze sweeping the jury. These were not random searches. They were calculated, intentional, and they paint a picture of a man preparing for something horrific. The prosecution's digital forensic expert took the stand next, walking the jury through Bryan's online history. Emails, shopping receipts, and bookmarked articles formed a timeline of chilling intent. One particularly damning email to Vanessa, dated weeks before Melissa's disappearance, read, "Once this is over, we can finally be free." "That's enough," Bryan's lawyer objected, his voice sharp. "This doesn't prove he committed the crime. These are circumstantial at best." The judge overruled, allowing the jury to continue hearing the evidence. Harris leaned back in his seat, watching Bryan out of the corner of his eye. The man's carefully constructed facade was cracking, piece by piece. The defense attempted to downplay the searches, suggesting they were taken out of context or part of an unrelated curiosity. But the prosecution quickly dismantled that argument. Caroline West, the district attorney, stood to address the court. "Curiosity?" she echoed, her voice rising. "Ladies and gentlemen, do these searches look like the idle musings of an innocent man? Or do they look like the methodical planning of someone with a sinister agenda?" The jury's faces remained impassive, but their silence spoke volumes. Back at the Howard residence, investigators had uncovered more evidence to strengthen the digital trail. On Bryan's work laptop, hidden in a folder disguised as tax records, they found downloaded articles detailing real-life cases of spouses who had committed murder for financial gain. One headline read, "How They Got Away with It, and How They Didn't." Harris made a note of the find, his expression grim. He wasn't just planning, he murmured to himself. He was studying. The next day in court, this discovery was presented. The folder's contents were projected for all to see, the text stark and undeniable. Bryan Howard wasn't just desperate, West told the jury. He was calculating. The defense scrambled to counter, but their arguments were weak, their foundation crumbling beneath the weight of the evidence. Bryan sat stone-faced, his hands clenched into fists as the digital trail unraveled the lies he had spun. By the end of the session, the jury had been presented with a chillingly detailed timeline. From the initial searches to the purchase of concrete blocks and duct tape, every click, every keystroke brought them closer to the inevitable conclusion. As the court adjourned for the day, Melissa's parents left the room in silence, their grief now mingled with a faint glimmer of hope. Harris watched Bryan being led out, his expression unreadable. But in his heart, he knew the walls were closing in. The truth was no longer a distant hope, it was a reality unfolding before their eyes. The courtroom was still, save for the rustle of papers and the occasional cough. It had been a grueling trial, filled with evidence, testimonies, and moments of raw emotion. Now, after weeks of deliberation, the jury had reached a decision. All eyes were on the foreperson as they stood to deliver the verdict that would determine Bryan Howard's fate. Melissa's parents sat in the front row, their hands tightly clasped together. Angela, Melissa's best friend, was beside them, her eyes fixed on Bryan, who sat expressionless at the defense table. Detective Scott Harris watched from the back, his sharp gaze unwavering as he observed the man who had been at the center of this harrowing case. The judge addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "We have, Your Honor." Bryan's attorney placed a reassuring hand on his client's shoulder, but Bryan didn't react. His face remained stoic, though the tension in his clenched jaw betrayed his composure. The courtroom collectively held its breath as the foreperson began to speak. "In the matter of the state of Florida versus Bryan Howard, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps and muffled sobs rippled through the room. Melissa's mother let out a cry, collapsing into her husband's arms as tears streamed down her face. Angela covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with emotion. Even some jurors appeared moved, their expressions reflecting the weight of their decision. Bryan remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. There was no outburst, no plea for mercy, only the cold silence of a man who had run out of options. The judge turned to address the courtroom. "Bryan Howard, you have been found guilty of the murder of Melissa Howard. Your actions have caused immeasurable pain to this family and this community. You will be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Harris leaned back in his seat, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Justice had been served, but the weight of the case lingered. Melissa's life, and the life of her unborn child, had been stolen in a calculated act of betrayal. No verdict could undo that. As the proceedings came to a close, Melissa's family was escorted from the courtroom, surrounded by friends and supporters. Reporters swarmed outside, their microphones thrust forward as they shouted questions. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one asked Melissa's father. He paused, his face lined with grief but resolute. "Justice was done today," he said quietly, "but it won't bring her back." Inside, Bryan was led away in handcuffs. Harris watched him go, noting the subtle slump in his shoulders, the hollow look in his eyes. For a man who had once believed he could outsmart everyone, the reality of his situation had finally set in. There was no escape. Later that evening, Harris returned to his office to finalize the case files. The evidence, receipts, text messages, and witness statements was neatly organized, a testament to the meticulous work that had gone into uncovering the truth. But as he closed the last folder, Harris couldn't shake the lingering sadness. "She deserved better," he murmured to himself. The verdict made headlines across the country, sparking debates about domestic violence, financial desperation, and the warning signs that often go unnoticed. Melissa's story became a symbol, a tragic reminder of how love and trust can be manipulated by greed. Melissa's family, though shattered, vowed to honor her memory. They established a foundation to support women in abusive relationships and to advocate for stronger protections for pregnant women. In every interview, they spoke of Melissa's kindness, her dreams, and the life that had been so cruelly cut short. As the sun set on the small Florida town, a quiet sense of closure settled over the community. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would take much longer to heal. And for Detective Harris, the case of Melissa Howard would forever be etched in his memory, a stark reminder of both the darkness that lurks in human nature and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The days following the verdict were a blur of emotions for everyone touched by the tragedy. The Howard home, once a place of joy and anticipation, now stood as a silent reminder of what had been lost. Melissa's family worked tirelessly to find solace in their grief, but the pain of her absence loomed heavy over every moment. Melissa's mother sat at the dining table, a small box of her daughter's belongings in front of her. Inside were ultrasound photos, a pair of baby shoes, and a tiny teddy bear Melissa had lovingly chosen for her unborn child. She clutched the bear tightly, her tears soaking into its soft fur. "She was so ready for this," she whispered. "She would have been the best mom." Angela visited often, becoming a pillar of support for Melissa's family. "We can't let her memory fade," she said one evening, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. Together, they began laying the groundwork for a foundation in Melissa's name. Its mission would be clear: to advocate for pregnant women, educate communities on the warning signs of domestic abuse, and provide resources for those in need. Meanwhile, Detective Scott Harris found himself reflecting on the case that had consumed him for months. Sitting at his desk late one night, he opened a folder containing a photograph of Melissa, her radiant smile, her hopeful eyes. "You deserve better," he murmured, his voice tinged with regret. Bryan Howard had been transported to a maximum security prison to serve his life sentence. Despite the jury's unanimous decision and the overwhelming evidence against him, Bryan remained stoic, offering no apologies, no remorse. For him, the truth was irrelevant. His silence, however, only deepened the anger and heartbreak of those he had wronged. The case had left an indelible mark on the quiet Florida community. Neighbors who once waved cheerfully now exchanged solemn nods, their shared tragedy forever changing the fabric of their lives. Mrs. Palmer, the elderly neighbor who had testified about Bryan's suspicious behavior, expressed the thoughts many shared. "We trusted him, we all did, and he betrayed us." The media moved on, their attention shifting to the next headline-grabbing case. But for Melissa's loved ones, the story was far from over. Her parents visited her grave weekly, their footsteps heavy as they walked through the cemetery. A small plaque engraved with Melissa's name and the words "Forever loved, never forgotten" marked the spot where she and her unborn child rested. One day, as they stood in the cool shade of an oak tree, Melissa's father spoke quietly. "She's watching over us," he said, his voice resolute, "and we'll make sure her story helps others." In the months that followed, the foundation grew, supported by donations from across the country. News stations occasionally revisited the case, highlighting the work being done in Melissa's name. Her story, though tragic, became a beacon for change, a testament to the strength of those who refused to let her memory fade. But even as healing began, the scars remained. Late at night, Melissa's mother would sometimes wake in a cold sweat, haunted by dreams of her daughter calling for help. Angela, too, found herself replaying conversations in her mind, wondering if there was something more she could have done. For Harris, the case became a defining moment in his career. Though he had solved many crimes, this one lingered in his mind like a shadow. He often drove past the lake where Melissa had been found, his thoughts heavy with the responsibility of ensuring justice was served. On the first anniversary of Melissa's passing, a small memorial was held at the park near her home. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered, lighting candles as the sun set over the horizon. Angela spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Melissa's life was stolen from her, but her legacy lives on in all of us. We'll never stop fighting for her." As the candles flickered in the cool evening breeze, the community stood united, their grief intertwined with a newfound purpose. And though the pain of losing Melissa would never truly fade, those who loved her vowed to keep her memory alive, ensuring that her story would continue to make a difference for generations to come. It was an ordinary afternoon when Angela received the call from Melissa's parents. Their voices, though steady, carried an undercurrent of urgency. "We found something," Melissa's mother said softly. "We think you should see it." Angela arrived at the Howard home, the familiar space now steeped in quiet sadness. On the kitchen table sat a worn journal, its leather cover faded and edges frayed. Melissa's mother pushed it toward Angela, her hands trembling slightly. "This was hers," she said, her voice breaking. "We didn't know it existed until now." Angela's fingers hovered over the journal before gently flipping it open. The entries began months before Melissa's disappearance, each page revealing pieces of her inner world, her excitement about the baby, her dreams for the future, and eventually her growing fear. "I don't know what's happening to us," one entry read. "Bryan used to be so attentive, but now he feels like a stranger. He won't talk to me. He's always out late. I'm scared, but I don't want to believe the worst." Another entry, dated just weeks before she went missing, stopped Angela cold. "He's been talking about money a lot lately. The bills, the baby. It's all he seems to care about. Sometimes I catch him looking at me like I'm a problem he's trying to solve. I keep telling myself I'm imagining it, but what if I'm not?" Tears streamed down Angela's face as she read Melissa's final entry, dated 2 days before her disappearance. "If anything happens to me, please make sure the truth comes out. Don't let him get away with it. Promise me." Melissa's mother wept quietly, her hands clutching the edges of the table. "She knew," she whispered. "She knew something wasn't right." The discovery of the journal added a haunting new layer to Melissa's story. It was more than just evidence. It was her voice, her final plea for justice. Angela, determined to honor her friend's memory, worked with the foundation to ensure that Melissa's words would be shared as part of their advocacy. Detective Scott Harris, upon hearing of the journal, was deeply moved. He read the entries in his office late one evening, the weight of Melissa's words pressing heavily on his heart. "She tried to fight," he murmured to himself. "She saw the danger, and she tried." The journal was later presented at a public event held by Melissa's foundation. Angela stood before a crowd of supporters, holding the small, fragile book in her hands. "This is Melissa's voice," she said, her tone unwavering. And though Bryan tried to silence her, he failed. Her words will live on, guiding us as we fight for those who can't fight for themselves. As Angela read excerpts from the journal, the audience listened in solemn silence. Many moved to tears. Melissa's story, once shrouded in tragedy, now stood as a beacon of resilience and a call to action. Months later, the journal was published as part of a campaign to raise awareness about the warning signs of domestic abuse and financial exploitation. Melissa's name became synonymous with courage and hope, her story sparking conversations and saving lives in ways she could never have imagined. For Angela and Melissa's family, the journal was both a source of pain and a gift. It gave them a glimpse into Melissa's thoughts, her fears, and her strength. And though they would never fully heal from her loss, they found solace in knowing that her voice had not been silenced. On a quiet evening, Melissa's mother sat in the nursery her daughter had lovingly prepared, the journal resting on her lap. She ran her fingers over the pages, her tears falling softly onto the ink. "We're keeping our promise," she whispered. "You won't be forgotten." The Howard home, once filled with anticipation for new life, now served as a place of remembrance, a testament to a woman whose final words became a lifeline for others. Melissa's story, though rooted in tragedy, blossomed into a legacy of change. And in the hearts of those who loved her, Melissa Howard lived on, forever a guiding light in the fight for justice. What do you think of Bryan Howard and the decisions he made? Were the signs of his motives clear or hidden in plain sight? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that uncover the dark truths behind closed doors. Hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest uploads.